And we are live. A minute late, but we are live. I don't know about alive, but live.
True.
Yeah. So let's have Doctor. The doctor's in the house.
Doctor's in the house.
Why don't you give us a brief introduction again for those who may be tuning in for the first time? Who are you and why should we care?
I am a retired college professor and pastor who has used my retirement to just keep right on doing what I was doing before, which is to try to express any which way I can the glory and the wonder of the gospel of Jesus Christ and the glory and the wonder of the God who gave us that promise that through faith in Christ we could have salvation, forgiveness of our sins, and eternal life. And there probably isn't much reason why you should care, but hopefully you care about some of the questions that we've been dealing with in this series. And tonight we're going to look at one that bedevils a lot of people and continues to do so, and is maybe one of the central questions of the modern world. Um, didn't ancient people just believe in miracles because they didn't understand science? The people used to believe in miracles because they didn't realize that things work according to natural laws, which we now have figured out, we understand. So we don't need miracles anymore. In fact, miracles are just not only unnecessary but absolutely unbelievable. To believe in a miracle simply shows that you are back in the dark ages and have not caught up with the scientific revolution. Um, didn't ancient people believe in miracles because they didn't understand science? We have on the screen right now an overview of what we're going to be talking about. There's the question. And what we're going to discover is ancient people knew more than we think they did. They weren't as ignorant as we think they are. And we'll look at some of the pretty astonishing things that they knew and understood. Not just knew, but understood and had figured out. And consequently, the answer to the original question is basically no. They knew quite enough to keep them from accepting miracles naively. And so they did not believe in miracles simply because they were ignorant of the laws of science. There's got to be another reason why they believed in them, because that reason that the secular worldview would like you to accept just doesn't work. And therefore, we will see that the relationship between science and miracles, between scientific law and miracles, is a lot more complicated than people think. So, first, let's take a look at the supposed ignorance of ancient people. First example: in 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue and
Yep.
refuted the flat Earth theory. Everybody believed that the Earth was flat, but Columbus proved that it was round by sailing uh, west to reach the east. Uh, People get taught this, or in effect, they get taught this in school. You'd be surprised how many people think this is true. But in fact, Columbus proved absolutely nothing because he didn't go far enough. He never reached the east by sailing west because America was in the way. Uh, and in fact, we have known that the earth was round since at least the 3rd century BC. Eratosthenes was a Greek uh, scientist. That word is a little bit anachronistic, but I don't know what else to call him. He was a Greek mathematician and scholar, and he proved during his lifetime, you can see his years there from 285 to 194 BC. You have to get used to the fact that before Christ, the years go backwards. And so the higher numbers are actually the earlier ones. born in 285, dies in 194, a pretty ripe old age for those days. He proved that the earth was round by setting up sticks of equal length in different places and carefully measuring the shadows. And they weren't even though the length of the stick was the same, the length of the shadow was not. Why? Because the sun is not hitting the two sticks at exactly the same angle at the same time. It's a very interesting experiment he did.
Yeah.
And not only did he prove by this method that the earth was round, spherical, he calculated the circumference of the earth and got within a couple 100 miles of the actual figure.
Wow.
Pretty astonishing.
Yeah.
And so at the time of Columbus, every educated person already believed that the earth was spherical. We're moving ahead a little bit too fast, but that's okay.
Okay, I'll back up. Watch that. Fixed.
We're still thinking about Eratosthenes. When Columbus sailed, he might have had some uneducated sailors who were worried about falling off the end of the earth. But educated people already knew that the earth was round. Now, the curvature of the earth is in fact observable. I've illustrated it in the picture here. I mean, you can go out to space and look, and you can see the earth is curved, and it's in fact roughly spherical. But you can observe it yourself by standing on the beach, standing on the shore, and watching a ship either sail into the harbor or sail away. The tall ship, it will not, if it's sailing away, it will not just get smaller until it's invisible. It will disappear from the bottom up. Or if it's sailing into the harbor towards you, you'll first see the crow's nest or the top, whatever the smokestack if it's a steamship, and it gradually becomes visible until the bottom shows up and you can see the whole thing. Why is this happening? Because it's coming up over the horizon, and there's enough distance to where you actually see the top before you see the hull. In fact, if you go out to the Great Plains, there are places in Kansas, places like that, where the distance and the flatness is sufficient. It's kind of ironic that we're using flatness to prove curvature, but you need what's unobstructed, straight line to the horizon to see it. You can actually watch a semi-truck do this. I've seen it. I'm sure Don Vino has seen it with all the driving that he's done. You can observe the curvature of the earth yourself, and ancient people had done so. They weren't stupid. They were not stupid. Now, the difference between us and them is that they had not yet, and now we can go to the next one, they had not yet formulated the scientific method. They had not formalized it in a way that they could practice it systematically. And it had not yet occurred to them that that was a method they could use to make discoveries. But they were observant. They observed natural phenomena, and they could make logical deductions from what they observed. The difference is what happened in the 17th, moving into the 18th century, was that the scientific method became a method. The idea that you make an observation, you form a hypothesis to explain what you observed, then you create an experiment to test the hypothesis, and it either confirms, the experiment either confirms or disconfirms it, and based on that, you revise it until you get an understanding of what's actually happening. Think about Galileo, for example. Everybody thought, because Aristotle said so, and everybody had thought since Aristotle, that if you drop a heavy object and a light object, the heavy object will fall faster. And just stands to reason, right? And in fact, it looks like you can observe this happening because if you drop, say, a small cannonball and a feather, the resistance of the air will hold the feather up and slow it down. But if you drop them in a vacuum, the feather and the cannonball hit the ground exactly at the same time. And so Galileo, he's famous for using the telescope to discover the moons of Saturn and discovering that shadows, the way shadows were cast by the sun on the planets and the moons using his telescope, gave further evidence, not just for the sphericity of the Earth, which they already knew, but that the sun was in the center of the solar system. The other thing he's famous for is he thought, let's find out. Let's not just assume because Aristotle said so. Let's go find out. And so he took two cannonballs, a lighter one and a heavy one. And in this case, their wind resistance was going to be, air resistance was going to be about the same, and went up on the Leaning Tower of Pisa, which is very convenient because if you get on the right side of it, you got a straight shot at the ground, and you're not going to smash the building with your cannonballs. And he drops them, and lo and behold, they hit the ground at the same time. So using experiments, an experiment is simply a designed and controlled observation to understand what actually is true about the natural world and how it works. And so the scientific method, and then using mathematics along with that to understand natural laws that can be expressed in terms of mathematics, is a modern phenomenon. And the systematic application of that has enabled us to learn a lot of things about the way the natural world works that people previously didn't know. But the difference between us and ancient people isn't simply that we knew things that they didn't know. When it comes to miracles, they knew the things they needed to know. Let's see if we can get back to the slides for a minute here. Yeah. What did ancient people know? Let's take a fairly important miracle to the Christian faith, and that would be the virginal conception of Jesus. Mm-hmm. We call it the virgin birth, which is a little bit lazy because Jesus' birth was actually perfectly natural. It was the conception that took place without the aid of a human father, without the aid of a human sperm cell. The virginal conception of Jesus. So, did Mary and Jesus believe that Jesus was conceived by a miracle because they were ignorant of the laws of science? Did they believe this miracle happened because they didn't know where babies come from? No. I mean, ask yourself a simple question. Why was Joseph going to call off the wedding?
Right.
Why was Joseph going to call off the wedding? Because he knew perfectly well how babies get into wombs, and he knew perfectly well he hadn't put that one there. And so he drew the exact same conclusion that a modern geneticist or a modern embryologist would draw with the situation he was confronted with. Right. He didn't know technical details that we now know about these sciences, but he knew the relevant information just as well as we do. And he drew the exact same conclusion from it that a modern person would draw, and he was going to call off the wedding. So it was not ignorance of science that caused Joseph to believe in a miracle. What was it? He didn't accept the miracle because he was naive and because he didn't understand science. He accepted it not because of his ignorance of science, but because of his knowledge of something else.
Mm-hmm.
His knowledge of God and the power of God, and his knowledge of the angel who appeared to him and told him it was okay. The child was from the Holy Spirit. It was miraculous. It was the fulfillment of prophecy that he already believed in. And he must have been, the whole time, he must have been so conflicted. Like, I thought I knew Mary. There's no way she would have done that. But obviously she did.
I trusted her. What's the matter?
Yeah. What's wrong with that woman?
And when the angel told him that it was okay, and he decided he would marry her anyway, it had nothing to do with his ignorance of science, because he knew the science, and he shows that he knew the relevant facts just as well as modern people do, because he acted exactly the same way we would have acted in that situation until God intervened. God had to intervene to cause Jesus to be conceived in Mary's womb, and he intervened with the angel to enable Joseph to get past his perfectly good knowledge of the relevant scientific facts. We've added technical detail, but the relevant fact Joseph knew just as well as we do. Okay? So, this idea that because now we're scientific, we can't believe in miracles anymore. The astonishing ignorance here is not the ignorance of ancient people about science, because Eratosthenes had calculated the circumference of the earth astonishingly accurately for his day, and Joseph knew where babies come from and how they get into wombs just as well as we do.
And he spoke with the angel, as you pointed out. That's sort of an unusual occurrence.
Yes. So the astonishing ignorance here is not the ignorance of science by ancient people. It's the ignorance of ancient people on the part of secular scientists that is just absolutely mind-blowing. So we need to look at David Hume, 18th century skeptical empiricist philosopher, who in 1758 published An Inquiry Concerning Human Understanding, which contains one of the most influential philosophical arguments in the history of philosophical arguments. Hume was trying to provide a philosophical foundation for the success of the early scientific movement. And so he, in the process, gave his argument that it's never rational to believe in a miracle. People constantly, I hear people saying that Hume proved or allegedly proved or thought he had proved that miracles are impossible. And Hume wasn't dumb enough to say anything that's stupid. And that's, I think, the next point on the screen is
as a matter of fact, it is.
Yeah, he did not try to prove miracles were impossible, because he knew that you can't do that. You can't prove a negative.
Right.
Let me, to illustrate this, what do you have to do in order to establish the fact that there is such a thing as a black swan? What do you have to do?
You have to find a black swan.
Find one. Okay, that's doable. Now, if you want to prove that there's no such thing as a black swan, what do you have to do?
Just stay home.
You have to examine every swan in the universe.
Exactly.
And have some means of proving that you didn't miss one.
And that's even
or that one didn't pop up after you went through that area.
So you can't. The difficulty of proving a negative is well known in philosophy, and Hume knew that he couldn't do that. So what he did try to prove is that it's never rational to believe in a miracle.
He went around it.
And he managed to convince an awful lot of people that this is true. One of the most influential philosophical arguments of all time. And so your friends and your neighbors who believe that miracles are impossible, you can trace that belief back to this argument historically. Now, they may have never heard of Hume,
Mm-hmm.
and they think miracles are impossible, which Hume never even claimed to have proved. But what he did think he had proved is that it's never rational to believe in a miracle. So let's examine the steps of the argument as to how he thought he had done that. We begin with a definition. Hume defines a miracle as a violation of a natural law. Now, that's a definition a lot of people would probably accept. Obviously, if natural laws happen the way we expect them to, you don't have a miracle. When a miracle takes place, something other than what natural law normally produces seems to have occurred. And so most people don't question the definition. We're going to in a few minutes.
Right.
But most people don't.
And I'm not sure exactly, but I'd like to interrupt. And you may already be going to say this, but well, you may not violate the natural law. It seems to me you can at least supersede the natural law. We do that every time we get in an airplane. The natural law of gravity keeps us on the ground, but something else kicks in to fly the plane against the laws of gravity.
The laws of aerodynamics.
Aerodynamics, right. So that
So,
supersedes it.
But nobody thinks that nobody today thinks that flying is a miracle.
No.
Most people understand that you're using one natural law to overcome another one. Anyway, right now we're just trying to understand what Hume claimed.
Right.
A miracle is a violation of a natural law. Natural laws are based on uniform experience. Okay, here's the way science works. It's based on repeatable and repeated experiments. So every time you break down the composition of water, you get H2O. You get two hydrogens, one oxygen. Two hydrogen atoms, one oxygen atom. That ratio exactly every single time. And you never get anything else. Water is always H2O. It was H2O if you do the experiment in 1893, and if you do it in 2023, and 100 years from now, if you do the experiment again, you're going to get the same result. If you do the experiment in Illinois, you do it in Georgia, you do it in Colorado, you do it in Antarctica, you do it on one of the moons of Jupiter, you get the same result.
I feel like I'm going to throw green eggs and ham here for a minute.
You want to raise your hand?
If you don't, then you messed up the experiment.
Yeah.
Okay. Anytime somebody gets an anomalous result, you need to be able to show that they messed up the experiment, and because laws of nature aren't random, and they are amazingly trustworthy. Mm-hmm. So natural laws are based on repeated experiments that everybody who does it gets the same result every time. If that doesn't happen, you haven't gotten in the position to be able to formulate a natural law yet. Okay? If that's the case, then because a person reporting a miracle is going against the uniform experience of the entire human race, it's always more likely that he is either deceived or deceiving you than it is that he's telling the truth. Okay? So, let's pause on this one for a minute. Let's say that I show up tonight and I say, guys, did you see what happened this morning? The sun came up in the west.
Oh.
How many of you believe me?
Well, if you're
Let's say
standing
it's a
upside
first
down,
period class. How many of you are even going to bother to go look out the window and check and see if I'm right? You know, it's like, why not? Because every single time you ever did get up early enough and take your compass out and check, it was in the east. And every single time anybody else in the entire history of the human race looked, it was in the east. And you understand that because of the way the earth spins on its axis in relationship to the sun, it not only always has been in the east, but it kind of has to be.
Well, right, unless the planet stops midstream and starts rotating the other way.
right?
If the planet stopped, we would have all be shooting off of it about 2,000 miles an hour because of our momentum, because they haven't invented inertial dampers for planets yet.
Oh,
okay.
No brake pads.
All right. So if I say, guys, did you hear what happened in the funeral home last night? This guy who'd been dead for 3 days, in the middle of his funeral service, sat up in his coffin, got up out and walked away.
What?
Now, I use that example because we, in fact, believe in a resurrection that happened in history, but you're not going to believe that story because what are the odds? You know, how many people have you personally known who died? How many of those people are still dead? 100% multiplied by everybody's experience that we can find out about. And so you're going to say, and Hume is going to say, you're rational to say, you're going to say the odds that Dr. Williams is either deceived himself, okay, he's telling us this, he thinks it's true, but he believed this cock and bull story, and now he's spreading it. He's either deceived himself. You got 3 options. I'm deceived myself. I'm trying to deceive you, or I'm telling the truth. And the third option, that I'm telling the truth about this, is almost infinitely small compared to the other 2. And so any rational human being is going to always say that it's more likely the guys who wrote the Gospels are either lying or they were themselves deceived than it is that they're telling the truth. And this is a very, very important point for us to get, because as Christians, we need to be able to justify why we're making an exception for that particular event 2,000 years ago, when we would demand an awful lot of evidence before we would believe the same story today, because natural laws, in fact, are very reliable and we haven't experienced a lot of exceptions to them. I think that I have experienced a couple of miracles in my life. I know another person or 2 who I'm convinced experienced a miracle. There was a lady in the church I pastored back in the 1980s who had cancer. The growth was so aggressive and that you could actually see it bulging out of her side, you know, against the cloth in her dress. And she went in for surgery and it wasn't there. It was gone. I mean, the doctors couldn't find it. And I personally saw the before and after x-rays. You know, it's like the doctor said, we can't explain it. Now, if you're a Christian, you accept the fact God miraculously healed her, and no medical explanation that we can come up with that would have it happening naturally is going to work. But you know, I hear 100 urban legends about miracles, and most of them, when I investigate them, the closer I get to the actual event, the fuzzier the information gets.
Right.
You know, most of them are urban legends. 1 out of 100 turns out to be true. So Hume is not just wrong. There are a couple of critical problems. We can go back to the formula for a minute. I think
Okay.
it's going to be important to see the actual wording of his
Okay.
conclusion.
Let me do that for you. How about that?
There we go. Point 3. The word always. If Hume had said, it's usually or almost always more likely that the person reporting a miracle is either deceived or being deceived, we wouldn't have a problem. Because that's the way we operate too. Even though we're people of faith, we don't believe every miracle story that comes down the pike.
It's true.
We demand good evidence before we're going to believe one. But Hume's conclusion was, and the key word in statement 3 is always, and corresponds in statement 4 to the word never. Hume concluded it was never rationally justified to believe that a miracle has happened. Okay. Now, as Christians, we're wanting to say it's sometimes rationally justified to believe that a miracle has happened. And we're going to focus on one time, which is the resurrection of Christ from the dead on the 3rd day after his crucifixion, because that's the one that matters. If you can believe that one, then you can believe the other miracles done by Jesus himself or those commissioned by him. If you don't believe that one, none of the others matters anyway. So that's where we're going to focus. Now, how do we get to the place, in spite of Hume's argument, and in spite of the fact that we almost agree with him, because 99+% of the time we operate exactly the way he's describing it, and we're justified in doing so. You know, it's terrible when people carelessly repeat rumors about miracles that they can't actually verify, because it just destroys our credibility.
Right.
And there's a lot of that goes on. So yeah, we're skeptical, but we don't turn that common sense approach into a metaphysical absolute and say always or never. Why not? We got to justify that. That's where we're going in the next place. There are 2 major flaws in Hume's argument, 2 logical fallacies. And the first one is the fallacy of straw man. So we throw the yellow flag and say, we got a problem with the definition. Is a miracle a violation of a natural law? The answer to that question is not necessarily. Not necessarily. C.S. Lewis gives a wonderful example in his book, Miracles, in his example of the billiards table. The laws of physics tell me that if I shoot the cue ball into the 8 ball, given such and such a position of them on the table, if I shoot the cue ball into the 8 ball at such and such a velocity, at such and such an angle, with such and such a spin, the 8 ball goes into the corner pocket. Okay? And so I do that, but an invisible hand shoves the cue ball and it goes into the side pocket instead. Have any laws of nature been broken? And the answer is no. The laws of physics work perfectly. but there was a force applied to the 8-ball, which our equations didn't take into account. Okay. Now, a lot of the miracles in the Bible could easily be explained in this way. Okay. So the wind, some of them even have hints that this might be what's happening. Like the wind that's mentioned with the crossing of the Red Sea, when the Red Sea stands up. And in fact, there are winds in shallow parts of the Red Sea that occasionally create this kind of effect. The miracle in this case would be in the timing. The quail that show up when they need something to eat, or the locusts that show up in Egypt. These are natural events where the miracle's in the timing. That is, God could have brought the locust, brought the wind, the axe head that floated. Any one of us can make an axe head float. All we got to do is stick our hand under it and lift it up to the surface of the water. So the force of your hand overcomes the force of gravity and the relative density of the axe head versus the water. You can make stuff happen that wouldn't normally happen and that nobody is predicting by simply applying a force that we didn't take into account or we couldn't have anticipated. Now, I'm not saying, and we don't need to say, that God can't break the laws of nature or never breaks them. We don't need to claim that. How God does the miracle, Scripture is usually pretty silent on that. And some miracles are easier to explain this way than others. But the point is, it's easy to see that God could do miracles if he wanted to without breaking natural laws. He could do it by using them. The laws that he wrote, he simply applies a force that comes from outside of the natural world. When that force is applied to the natural world, the natural laws accept it and
Move on.
work with it.
Yeah.
And no laws are broken at all. Okay. Now, what does this do to Hume's argument? Everything in Hume's argument depends on that definition. And so, if the definition of a miracle as a violation of a natural law isn't necessarily true, then the whole argument is moot. He's got nothing. Because everything is built on that foundation. And we don't have to accept it. In fact, there's no reason to accept it. Again, we're not claiming that God can't or doesn't ever break natural laws. We don't know that. God wrote them. He set them up. He normally lets them work because miracles wouldn't be miracles if they happened all the time.
Right.
If natural laws weren't very trustworthy and reliable, you wouldn't even be able to identify a miracle. If random stuff just happened all the time and we didn't have trustworthy laws that we could formulate, we couldn't tell a miracle from something that wasn't. But that definition isn't necessarily so. And consequently, the whole argument is moot. It doesn't prove anything because we just took the foundation out from under it. Everything in it is built on that foundation. And without that foundation, it goes nowhere. Okay. Now, there's a second serious flaw. And that is that the argument commits the fallacy of begging the question. So we throw the yellow flag out onto the field again. Player is begging the question, tried to assume his premise was already correct before he established it. How do we know that human experience is uniform on the critical point? What does uniformity mean? It means there's been no exceptions, right? So, oh my goodness, has Hume just been maneuvered back into the position of trying to prove a negative?
Could be.
There's never been no except. That's a negative. That's a black swan.
Right.
How do we know human experience is uniform at this point?
Right.
That is, in fact, the very thing we're trying to find out. We know what the normal outcome of death is, and we're talking about clinical death now, or we're talking about show enough death, not just a temporary cessation of heartbeat or EKG where the person is defibrillated or gets resuscitation and comes back to life. We're talking about somebody who's been dead for like 2 or 3 days, where even modern medical technology is not going to do anything for them. They're not just mostly dead. We can't even get Miracle Max to give them a pill. So, I mean, this is show enough dead. We know where that normally goes.
Mm-hmm.
The question is, was there an exception to that?
Mm-hmm.
And Hume's argument basically boils down to the fact that there's been no exceptions because there's been no exceptions. That's the very thing he has to prove. So the entire experience of the human race minus 1, is that uniform? No. The entire experience of the human race minus 500.
Definitely not.
Is that uniform? No. If 500 people saw the risen Christ, there's no uniformity for Hume to appeal to in his argument. He's appealing as evidence to the very thing he has to prove. Okay? So the argument fails to prove that it's always more likely that the person reporting a miracle is deceived or deceiving. It proves what we already knew by common sense, that usually that's the case, but it absolutely fails to prove that it's always the case. The argument fails to prove that it's never justified rationally to believe in a miracle. What would it take for us to accept a miracle as true and factual? Particularly a miracle from past history where we didn't observe it ourselves. What would it take? That's the next screen. When is belief justified? Well, David Hume thought he was driving the last nail in our coffin, and he was actually prying the lid open. Hume said that only if a denial entails a bigger miracle than the report itself. Could you ever believe in a miracle? Well, it would have to be a situation which Hume thinks is impossible, where denying the miracle would entail a bigger miracle than the report itself. Now, can you remember our episode on the resurrection? An awful lot of those theories about other things that happened, that could have happened to the body, fit this criterion to a T. If you know anything about the physiology of physiology of crucifixion, the swoon theory, that would be a bigger miracle than God actually raising Jesus from the dead.
Mm-hmm.
You know, 500 people had the same hallucination.
Right.
That is just as contrary to the psychological laws of hallucinations as a resurrection would be to the scientific laws relevant to biology and death. Okay? So, wow, this particular case, it almost looks like we can beat Hume with his own bat.
Mm-hmm.
We can grab his own bat and knock him in the head with it. Because Jesus' resurrection kind of actually looks like it does that. Does Jesus satisfy that criterion? Yeah, we've just been establishing that point. Okay, what would you need to be in place? Now you've got multiple attestation from witnesses who claim they saw the risen Christ, or are reporting the reports of people who saw it.
Mm-hmm.
They fit all of the historical and legal criteria for examining testimony. We've got multiple attestation. We've got the right kind of consistency with discrepancies but not contradictions. We've got hostile witnesses. We've got embarrassing testimony. They mark all of they check all of the boxes for testimony that's reliable. And even still, we might be hesitant, but there's a couple of more things that if those two things get added to the picture, then I'm going to say that rational justification has been achieved. And they are, is there a God who could do it?
Mm.
Okay. And is this something that God would do? Is there a God who could do it? Now, the whole question of does God exist and all the classical arguments for the existence of God, we don't have time to go over all of that right now. They might come up in other episodes.
Right.
But the bottom line is there's good reason to believe that this universe did not just pop into existence out of nothing and organize itself into highly calibrated, mathematically precise laws. That's another miracle bigger than the miracle of God creating it.
Right.
My opinion. I don't have enough faith to believe in naturalistic evolution. I'm a Christian because I just don't have enough faith to believe the alternative. So there's a God. There's good reason to think there is a being who could do it. But then the real critical question is this something that God would do? And in fact, it is, because he promised to do it. Starting in the Old Testament, coming down to Jesus himself, over and over and over, trying to convince the disciples that he was going to be killed and the third day rise from the dead. And then he does it. Why would God do that? Because Jesus was Jesus. He was the only person who lived a perfect life. And it was a life in which he demonstrated over and over again his own mastery over nature and even over death. Widow's son of Nain, Lazarus, Jairus' daughter, at least 3 people that Jesus himself had raised from the dead. And Lazarus was even after he had already started to rot.
Mm-hmm.
So, is there a God who could do this? Is this something that God would do? I would suggest that if you read the Gospels and really focus in on who Jesus was, why he was here, that, yeah, the resurrection is the only finish to that story that makes any sense. Without the resurrection, Jesus' whole life makes no sense whatsoever.
Mm-hmm.
So, if I have really, really solid reporting, which we usually don't have, okay, in the case of the lady from Marietta, before and after X-ray shots, saw the bulging tumor sticking out of her side, saw her looking normal within days apart. You know, I got pretty good reportage because I saw it myself. If I hadn't seen it myself, you're asking, you know, you might want to know, can I show you those X-rays? And they existed. I saw them. I don't have them in my possession, but somebody does.
Mm-hmm.
You know, good reportage. There's a God who could do this, and this is the kind of thing he would do because he's told us what he was going to do through prophecy. Jesus was prepared for by providence, predicted by prophecy for 2,000 years.
Mm. Yep.
And if there's ever anybody, you know, about whom you could believe this, it's Jesus or nobody.
Right.
Okay? It's not some random dude we're claiming God raised from the dead.
Mm.
This is the inevitable climax of a life that had spent 3 years showing us that it was sovereign over life and death.
Yep.
And so put all that together, and yes, it's rationally justified to believe that Jesus was raised from the dead in spite of everything that David Hume's argument can say. And that's where we are. No, ancient people didn't believe in miracles because they were ignorant of science. Being knowledgeable about science just helps you more readily recognize a miracle. Because it is an exception to what science will tell you normally happens. And miracles are rare. The whole word miracle means wonder, something that gets your attention, because it's not what happens every day.
Right.
If miracles weren't rare, they wouldn't be miracles. They're rare, and consequently, even people of faith need good evidence. And we need good evidence, good reportage, but we also need to be able to connect that reportage with the character of God as is revealed in Scripture and in Christ. And you bring all that to focus on the resurrection of Jesus. And yeah, I call that rational justification. So, any questions?
Yeah, I have one, and it's on the other end of things.
Mm-hmm.
We call that rational justification because there's evidence, witnesses, etc., that would give credence to the claim of the resurrection. On the other hand, we have a worldview that says in the beginning was nothing, and nothing exploded into everything, but they cannot duplicate that, so that would be, by the definitions we're working with, a miracle. So they have to believe in a miracle in order to deny miracles. So how does that work?
Well, they call it a singularity.
Mm.
The
I
definition
understand
of
what
a
they call it, but it's still, can it happen again?
The definition of a singularity is an event that cannot be explained by the laws of science as we currently know them.
Sounds like a miracle to me.
But they have faith
Oh, yeah.
that if we can finally get the unified theory that combines quantum mechanics and string theory and general and special relativity, we'll eventually be able to explain it by the laws
Right.
of science. They have blind faith in science.
Mm.
They think because they follow science, they don't have faith. They only follow the facts. In fact, it's blind faith in science.
Mm-hmm.
But science only works if rationality is a thing. And how can rationality be a thing in a random universe?
Right.
So it makes sense to believe that nature can be explained by rational laws if it was created by a rational God who wrote those laws. So you can put your faith in science blindly, or you can put your faith in the God who explains why science works and is possible in the first place. Those are your choices. They convince themselves they don't have faith, but in fact they do, because it's a singularity. We can't explain it yet, but someday we will.
Yeah. We'll get there.
It's the it's kind of the evolution of the gaps approach.
Right.
Evolution. I was exactly thinking, yes, the evolution of the gaps.
Christians are accused of believing in a God of the gaps. We just put God in those places that science hasn't explained. But we're not believing in God because of ignorance. We're believing in God because of our knowledge, including our knowledge of science,
right,
which tells us that this universe is way too fine-tuned for life to have happened by accident.
Mm-hmm.
Tells us that it couldn't exist by itself without help. And so you're going to have to put your faith in something. And I would argue put it in the thing that actually explains the other things. And instead of just basically blind faith in human intelligence to eventually figure it out.
Questions, comments, anybody?
No, I mean this is.
We got a whole minute left.
Yeah. Woo!
Well, 2 minutes. Actually.
Yeah. No, this is great because that's always an issue with people. Like the miracles is always where they try to gotcha, but they really. You're right. They need more faith to not believe than to believe. So it just doesn't make sense.
Yeah, it's a complete myth.
Yeah.
That Christians have faith and secularists have facts.
Right. Therefore, we have no reason because we have faith.
There is no position that doesn't ultimately rest on faith in something.
Yeah, you have to believe something.
And so you might as well have faith in the thing that explains the other thing instead of the thing that leaves everything unexplained.
Right.
So with no time left, I'll play devil's advocate here. And if miracles are a real thing, then why doesn't God just pull a miracle every day to prove his existence?
Because it wouldn't if he did. Look, there was one generation of people who actually experienced that. Israel in the wilderness got manna every day.
Right.
You're walking through the wilderness for 40 years and your sandals don't wear out.
Yep.
Right.
Pigeons were delivered to your doorstep one day.
Yeah.
It's just, and you start out with the plagues and the Red Sea. And it's like if miracles happen every day, we would get used to them and we wouldn't notice them anymore. And we would be right back where we were, deciding whether we trust God or not.
Right.
And then, like I said earlier, a miracle is only a miracle if, in fact, the laws of nature are very stable. God does them in very strategic moments in order to get our attention and in order to give us the evidence for faith that we need. But isn't the stability and reliability of the laws of nature and the ability of the human mind to understand them in terms of mathematics, doesn't that kind of qualify as a miracle that's happening every day? I don't have any naturalistic explanation of that. And so the heavens declare the glory of God because they continue to exist, which they couldn't do without him.
Right. Yeah.
Well, we're going to sign off then for everybody, and we will see you all next week when we do chapter 8. And for those who are interested, I'll bring this back up here quickly because you have 2 books, The Young Christian Survival Guide and Answers from Aslan. Has that one come out yet, by the way?
Not yet. The Young Christian Survival Guide is, if you find these sessions interesting, you want more, where they came from, that's the book you want. Answers from Aslan, The Enduring Apologetics of C.S. Lewis, is supposed to be out the end of this month, so it's getting close.
All right.
And it will be a wonderful way of following up on an even deeper level some of the things we've been talking about.
Cool.
Okay.
Because C.S. Lewis was a better apologist than I am.
So we can say good night to Alan.
All right.
See you.